I always believed that when the time came for me to leave Apex Shield Systems, it would be on my own terms, sitting quietly in my office on a Friday afternoon, knowing I had completed a 30-year career built on discipline and unwavering dedication. I never pictured that moment arriving, with the sudden coldness of a corporate execution, in an industry where turning 53 somehow transforms you into an operational liability overnight. For decades, I had been the steady presence in the building, the principal cybersecurity architect whose office door was always open, the veteran engineer who had guided every wave of new recruits through the foundational complexities of our software architecture. What I never expected was to be treated like deprecated software, and legacy system that modern management was eager to wipe from the server drives. I had joined Apex Shield Systems when I was 26 years old, back when the company occupied a cramped commercial complex on the south side of Dallas. There were only 16 of us back then, operating out of a noisy room with 3 aging servers that generated enough heat to warm the entire floor during winter nights. I lived through every major infrastructural migration, every brutal compliance audit, every marathon programming session where sleep was measured in 30-minute naps on a folding chair in the server vault. I had sunk so deep into the mechanics of data security that every algorithmic pathway inside our flagship encryption platform, Aegis 9, felt like an extension of my own neurological pathways. Yet as I sat at my desk on a humid Tuesday morning, looking out across rows of pristine open-plan workstations occupied by newly hired engineers brought in from West Coast tech hubs, I felt like an alien standing inside the very fortress I had spent my adult life designing. The new engineering staff were undeniably brilliant, sharp, articulate, and remarkably fluent in the latest software frameworks and corporate jargon that required a quick mental translation on my part. They worked with impressive speed, but beneath their energetic banner was an unmistakable atmosphere of emotional detachment. To them, code was merely an asset to be pushed to production as quickly as possible, and experience was something to be measured by how many modern development badges you displayed on your digital profile. Whenever their glances crossed my glass enclosure, there was a subtle condescension in their eyes, the passive look someone gives to an antique grandfather clock in a sleek modern hallway. A curious historical artifact, but utterly irrelevant to the immediate future. The only person in the department who bridged that silent divide was Owen Miller. Owen was 27 years old, but unlike his peers, he possessed a rare architectural humility. He understood that underlying every modern user interface was thousands of hours of foundational logic that could not be replaced by trendy development methods. He frequently visited my office, leaning against the door frame to ask detailed questions about the core mathematical formulas behind Aegis 9. He wanted to know why I had structured the double-key verification layers the way I did 17 years ago, and why certain legacy failsafes had been hard-coded into the system kernel. I never treated him as a simple subordinate. I viewed him as one of the few true engineers who recognized that technology was built on principles, not trends. On a warm afternoon, while I was reviewing our quarterly vulnerability assessment, Owen pulled a chair beside my desk. His posture was tense, his eyes darting toward the glass partition before he spoke in a low, measured voice. He told me that during a late-night executive session on the 9th floor, senior management had discussed a sweeping organizational restructuring plan, and my name was at the top of the reclassification list. I looked at him, attempting to maintain a light-hearted composure to ease his obvious distress, asking if he thought they were preparing to push out the older staff. Owen did not return my smile. He quietly explained that the strategy team had calculated that replacing senior technical directors with mid-level recruits could reduce departmental payroll expenses by nearly 40% in a single fiscal quarter. I understood precisely what he meant. High salary, high tenure, and advanced age formed a triad that ruthless modern executives viewed as unnecessary overhead. I thanked Owen for his vigilance, reassuring him that I would handle whatever came, though internally I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The shift in company culture had accelerated dramatically 3 months earlier with the appointment of our new Chief Executive Officer, Eleanor Thorne. Eleanor arrived at Apex Shield, carrying the formidable reputation of a corporate turnaround specialist who had streamlined multiple middle-market technology firms. She possessed a sharp, magnetic presence, dressing in tailored gray suits and commanding every room she entered with calculated precision. During her introductory address to the company, I watched her from the second row of the main auditorium. Her presentation was a masterclass in corporate rhetoric, replete with sleek slides emphasizing agility, rapid innovation, artificial intelligence integration, and generational renewal. Yet as I listened closely, I noticed a striking omission. In her 40-minute speech about the grand future of Apex Shield, she did not mention Aegis 9 a single time. She gave no acknowledgement to the underlying security engine that generated 85% of our enterprise revenue. Nor did she acknowledge the veteran engineers who had built that engine line by line. In the weeks following her arrival, Eleanor instituted a series of high-level strategic alignment sessions. Long emails detailing new organizational goals were distributed daily. Yet my inbox remained strangely silent regarding invitations to those executive roundtables. By the time the third strategic planning meeting took place on the 9th floor, without my presence, the reality became indisputable. I was being systematically isolated from the decision-making process for the very platform I had created. One morning, Owen entered my office holding a printout of an internal organizational chart he had spotted on a shared network drive. Several boxes representing senior engineering roles occupied by staff over 50 years of age were highlighted with red review tags. I stared at the paper for a long moment, realizing that the corporate storm was no longer a distant possibility. It was gathering directly above my head. I looked at Owen, offered a reassuring word about staying focused on his work, and sent him back to his desk. But after he left, I sat alone in the quiet dusk of my office, watching the dark monitor reflect the worn lines of my face, lines earned through decades of midnight deployments and intense crisis management. The company I had poured my life into no longer recognized my value, and I knew that a fundamental rupture was imminent. The summons arrived precisely at 8:15 on Thursday morning. I had just poured my first cup of black coffee when a young human resources representative appeared at my office door, tapping softly on the frame with a nervous hesitation he could barely conceal. He informed me that Chief Executive Officer Eleanor Thorne requested my presence in her 9th floor executive office immediately. The formal tone and the word immediately left no ambiguity about the nature of the meeting. I carefully placed my mug on the desk, shut down my active terminal sessions, took a slow, grounding breath, and walked out into the corridor. The 9th floor of the Apex Shield building had always possessed a distinct climate, characterized not merely by the lowered temperature of the advanced environmental controls, but by the sharp impersonal atmosphere of corporate authority. Eleanor's corner office featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls offering an expansive view of the Dallas skyline. When I entered, she was standing near the window with her arms folded, gazing out over the city as if surveying a newly acquired domain. She did not turn immediately, allowing a long silence to linger in the room to establish dominance before gesturing toward the leather armchair opposite her mahogany desk. When she sat down, her expression was entirely composed, devoid of warmth or hostility, resembling a seasoned litigator preparing to deliver a routine opening statement. She stated plainly that Apex Shield was entering a phase of rapid transformation that demanded organizational agility, fluid leadership, and an alignment with modern technical paradigms. She noted that, while my historical contributions to the company's early development were appreciated, my current compensation structure and engineering philosophy no longer aligned with the strategic direction of the firm. Every word she spoke was a textbook example of corporate sanitization. Terms like strategic realignment, tenure optimization, and structural efficiency used as clinical instruments to sever a 26-year career in a matter of seconds. I sat quietly, observing her as she spoke. Had she offered even a brief moment of genuine gratitude or acknowledged the personal sacrifice required to build the company from 16 people in a garage office, I might have felt a lingering trace of sadness. But her demeanor was purely transactional, reflecting the cold certainty of an executive who believed she had executed a flawless tactical maneuver against an adversary who had no remaining options. She slid a thin manila folder across the polished desk, explaining that it contained my formal separation agreement, a standard severance package, equivalent to 6 months of base salary and a strict non-disclosure covenant. She added that per company security protocols, my network credentials would be revoked within 5 minutes, and security personnel would accompany me to collect my personal belongings. Before I could even process the document, the side door of her office opened, and 2 uniformed security officers stepped inside, standing silently near the threshold. Their presence was not aggressive, but it sent an unmistakable message. I was now considered an external security risk inside the building I had spent 26 years protecting. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, offering a practiced, professional closing remark, wishing me success in my future endeavors. I did not engage in a debate, nor did I express anger. I simply picked up the folder, stood up, and walked out of the executive suite with my head held high, leaving behind the quiet glass room and the woman who believed she had just cleared the board. When I returned to the main engineering floor, an intense, heavy silence settled over the room. The usual hum of conversations and keyboard clicks evaporated. Colleagues with whom I had shared decades of work glanced at me briefly before quickly averting their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their monitors. In corporate environments, watching a senior veteran get escorted out is an uncomfortable reminder of fragile mortality, and silence is the primary mechanism of self-preservation. Owen stood near the central cluster of servers, his face pale with suppressed anger. I caught his eye and gave a subtle, definitive shake of my head, warning him not to take a step toward me. I would not allow his career to become collateral damage on the day of my departure. Inside my private office, the black monitor already displayed a sharp system message. Account access revoked. I took the small cardboard box provided by the security officers and began packing the handful of personal items that had accumulated over 26 years. A framed photograph of our original 16-person engineering team taken on the lawn outside our first building, a ceramic mug presented to me after our first successful federal defense deployment, and 2 leather-bound notebooks containing handwritten mathematical proofs for encryption algorithms. Everything else in the room, the furniture, the hardware, the high-speed servers, belonged to Apex Shield. Placing those few items into the box felt like condensing half a lifetime into a light paper container. I walked out of the building into the glaring midday sun of Dallas. The heat hit my face, sharp and intense. I stood on the concrete plaza for a moment, looking up at the polished blue glass facade of the Apex Shield headquarters. Watching the corporate logo gleam in the light, 26 years of unbroken service had been dissolved in less than 10 minutes. To Eleanor Thorne and the board of directors, I was an obsolete cost center successfully liquidated from the balance sheet. But as I placed the box into the trunk of my car, a profound calm washed over me. They believed they had stripped me of my position, but they were entirely ignorant of a legal seed that had been planted 17 years ago. I drove home along the quiet suburban highways, the hum of the tires providing a steady rhythm to my thoughts. When I arrived at my house, my old golden retriever, Rex, greeted me at the door, nudging my hand with a quiet concern that animals reserve for moments of human hardship. I set the cardboard box on the kitchen counter, removed my jacket, and walked directly to the hallway storage closet. Deep in the back corner, behind stacks of archived personal records, sat a heavy silver steel lockbox, cold to the touch and covered in a fine layer of dust. I carried the box to the dining room table, retrieved the small brass key from my ring, and turned the lock. Inside lay the original founding documentation of Aegis 9, wrapped in protective acid-free paper. On top was a thick legal envelope bearing the letterhead of George Palmer, an attorney who had been my closest friend since our university days. 17 years ago, when Apex Shield was a struggling startup facing potential bankruptcy during an economic downturn, George had reviewed our initial software deployment plans. He recognized that while the company was eager to market Aegis 9 to enterprise clients, the corporate entity itself was structurally unstable and legally exposed. George had insisted on drafting a provisional copyright filing for the core encryption architecture under my individual name rather than the corporate entity to shield the intellectual property from potential creditor liquidation. I carefully unfolded the second document inside the folder, the master reversion clause, signed, sealed, and notarized by both myself and the original founding chief executive officer 17 years ago. The language drafted by George was brutally simple and legally absolute. It stated plainly that in the event that Gerald Vance was terminated from employment by Apex Shield Systems without documented legal cause, all ownership, patent rights, licensing authorities, and operational usage permits associated with the Aegis 9 encryption architecture would automatically revert entirely to Gerald Vance exactly 24 hours following the official timestamp of termination. Through 17 years of corporate expansion, executive turnover, and administrative reshuffling, Apex Shield had continuously utilized the platform, always postponing the formal legal transfer of full patent ownership to the corporate entity. Eleanor Thorne had just executed a termination that triggered a dormant legal mechanism designed to reclaim the core engine of a $750 million enterprise. I pulled out my phone and dialed George Palmer's direct line. George answered on the second ring, his voice calm and deliberate with the practiced composure of a veteran legal scholar. I did not waste time with small talk. I informed him that Eleanor Thorne had terminated my employment less than 2 hours ago without cause, handing me a standard severance agreement while revoking my access. I asked him to review the original 17-year-old filing and confirm whether the reversion clause remained legally enforceable under current federal intellectual property statutes. There was a brief pause on the line as George retrieved the digitized master file from his firm's secure archive. I could hear the steady clicking of his keyboard as he reviewed the original notarized documents. When he spoke again, his tone was completely serious. He confirmed that because Apex Shield had never executed a subsequent buyout contract or finalized an unconditional patent assignment agreement with me during the past 17 years, the provisional filing remained the governing legal instrument. He explained that by terminating me without documented cause, such as proven gross misconduct or criminal breach, the 24-hour countdown timer had officially commenced at 8:20 that morning. At 8:20 the following morning, every legal right to the underlying mathematics and codebase of Aegis 9 would revert exclusively to my personal ownership. George strongly advised me to submit an immediate formal notification of ownership update to the United States Patent and Trademark Office through their digital portal to establish an indisputable public record before Apex Shield realized their blunder. I sat down at my personal workstation, logged into the USPTO electronic system using my established digital credentials, and opened the Ownership Amendment interface. I meticulously uploaded high-resolution scans of the original provisional copyright, the notarized reversion clause, and the official termination notice signed by Eleanor Thorne. In the section requiring the legal basis for the ownership change, I selected the precise regulatory code. Automatic reversion of rights upon contractual trigger. I affixed my electronic signature, submitted the filing, and saved the official confirmation receipt displaying the exact timestamp. While I sat in the quiet comfort of my home office, an unscripted crisis was beginning to unfold deep within the administrative machinery of Apex Shield. Early the following morning, on the 10th floor of the corporate headquarters, a junior legal auditor named Tobias was performing a routine intellectual property audit in preparation for the upcoming Department of Defense contract renewal. Tobias was a diligent young paralegal whose primary responsibility was verifying that all patent registration numbers matched our active client deployment schedules. When he queried the federal database for the Aegis 9 master registration number, the screen did not display Apex Shield Systems as the primary title holder. Instead, the registrant field displayed a single name, Gerald Vance. Tobias initially assumed the result was a technical glitch within the federal registry. He refreshed his browser, cleared his cache, and re-executed the query from a secondary terminal, only to receive the identical result. Panic began to set in as he opened the attached public document index and saw the newly filed notice of reversion, complete with a verified federal confirmation stamp. Recognizing the catastrophic implications of what he was looking at, Tobias immediately printed the entire file packet and ran up the stairs to the office of Head of Legal Mrs. Holloway. Mrs. Holloway was a seasoned corporate attorney who had navigated dozens of complex commercial disputes, but as she read through the documents Tobias placed on her desk, the color drained from her face. She recognized the validity of the reversion clause instantly, as well as the complete absence of any corporate documentation proving a subsequent title transfer. Without saying a word to her assistant, she grabbed the file, bypassed the executive waiting area, and walked directly into Chief Executive Officer Eleanor Thorne's office, closing the heavy wooden door behind her. Eleanor was reviewing financial projections on her tablet when Mrs. Holloway laid the USPTO printout across her desk. Eleanor glanced at the paper with an expression of mild annoyance, dismissively stating that public registries frequently contained outdated data or filing errors that could be corrected with a routine administrative letter. Mrs. Holloway shook her head, her voice trembling slightly as she explained that this was not an administrative error. She pointed to the notarized signature on the reversion clause and the official timestamp showing that as of 24 hours after Gerald Vance's termination, Apex Shield Systems no longer possessed legal title or operational authority over the core encryption architecture of Aegis 9. Eleanor's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the weight of the revelation. For the first time since her arrival at the company, her impenetrable confidence showed a visible fracture. However, rather than acknowledging the severity of the mistake and seeking an immediate legal resolution, her instinct was to conceal the crisis. She instructed Mrs. Holloway to keep the filing strictly confidential, forbidding her from informing the board of directors or the external audit committee. Eleanor insisted that her legal team could locate a contractual loophole or draft an emergency injunction claiming that Gerald had executed the filing in bad faith to sabotage the company. Mrs. Holloway cautioned her that attempting to conceal an intellectual property title defect prior to a federal defense contract review constituted severe regulatory fraud. But Eleanor refused to relent. She believed she could outmaneuver the legal reality through corporate posturing. Convinced that an individual retired engineer would not possess the financial resources or legal stamina to battle a multi-million-dollar corporate legal team, what Eleanor failed to realize was that she was playing chess against a system designed by the very man she had dismissed, and every tactical move she made was drawing her deeper into a trap of her own making. The 14th floor of the Apex Shield headquarters had been transformed into a world-class conference venue for the flagship demonstration of Aegis 9. Bright blue spotlighting illuminated the central stage, where massive high-definition LED screens displayed sleek animations showcasing our advanced defense capabilities. The audience was composed of high-ranking military officials from the Department of Defense, chief technology officers from major aerospace contractors, defense industry journalists, and prominent investment analysts. The atmosphere was charged with high expectations, as this presentation was intended to finalize a $750 million federal defense procurement contract that would secure Apex Shield's financial dominance for the next decade. Eleanor Thorne stood backstage in a striking Navy suit, surrounded by her senior communications staff. She projected absolute mastery, smiling warmly as she greeted visiting dignitaries and board members. No one watching her could have guessed that behind her calm exterior was a woman desperate to prevent a legal disaster from coming to light. She had scheduled the live technical demonstration to execute automatically off our primary server cluster, confident that as long as the system remained operational, the federal delegation would sign the preliminary deployment authorization before any title dispute could reach the board. In the technical control room at the rear of the auditorium, Owen Miller sat at the main terminal matrix, overseeing the live data feeds. Throughout the morning, he had noticed unusual system anomalies popping up on his diagnostic monitors. Security verification protocols inside the Aegis 9 kernel were throwing persistent authentication errors, indicating that master access tokens were no longer validating under the corporate entity key. Owen did not know the full details of Gerald's legal actions, but he recognized the signature mathematical footprints of Gerald's original architecture asserting its master authority over the system. At 9 o'clock sharp, the house lights dimmed, and Eleanor stepped onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. Her voice resonated clearly through the sound system as she delivered a polished keynote address regarding the future of military-grade data protection. She spoke at length about innovation, architectural integrity, and Apex Shield's exclusive ownership of the world's most advanced encryption engine. After 20 minutes of persuasive rhetoric, she gestured dramatically toward the main display screen to initiate the live encryption benchmark test. She pressed the master execution button on the presenter remote. But instead of displaying the expected green benchmark metrics, the massive LED screens suddenly flashed a bright amber alert banner. A system-level security override triggered across the entire network platform, freezing the live execution environment. Displayed prominently in the center of the main stage screen was an automated federal compliance notice originating directly from the USPTO registry database. Execution halted. Intellectual property ownership verification required. Registrant, Gerald Vance. Status, sole title holder. A collective hush fell over the auditorium, followed by a sudden wave of confused murmurs. Eleanor's smile froze, her complexion turning ash gray under the stage lights. Before her communications team could cut the display feed, a senior legal counsel representing the Department of Defense delegation stood up from his front row seat. He retrieved a tablet from his briefcase, cross-referenced the live public registry, and addressed Eleanor in a firm, booming voice that echoed across the quiet hall. He demanded to know why the primary encryption platform Apex Shield was attempting to license to the United States military was registered under the personal ownership of a private individual who had been terminated 48 hours prior. As Eleanor struggled to articulate a coherent response, attempting to blame an unverified database synchronization error, a prominent defense technology reporter in the third row raised his tablet. He announced to the entire room that he had just received an authenticated internal document leak containing email records from head of legal Mrs. Holloway, proving that senior corporate leadership had been formally notified of the title defect 2 days earlier and had actively chosen to conceal it from federal regulators and the board of directors. The auditorium descended into immediate, chaotic uproar. The Department of Defense delegation stood up in unison, their lead officer declaring that all contract negotiations were suspended immediately due to catastrophic legal misrepresentation and potential fraud. Representatives from partner aerospace firms rushed toward the exits to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal, while journalists frantically began typing news flashes that would crash Apex Shield's stock price within the hour. Eleanor stood alone on the illuminated stage, surrounded by frozen screens displaying the name of the engineer she had discarded, as her corporate empire crumbled under the weight of her own hubris. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, an emergency session of the board of directors was convened in the executive boardroom. The atmosphere was brutal. Board members shouted over one another, as news reports highlighted a 30% plunge in company market valuation. Mrs. Holloway was called before the board and laid out the entire paper trail, confirming that Eleanor had received explicit written warnings regarding the reversion clause and had ordered a cover-up. Simultaneously, Owen Miller submitted a secure internal declaration confirming that executive leadership had instructed technical staff to bypass system security alerts prior to the demo. Recognizing that the company faced complete ruin, the board chair immediately executed a resolution terminating Eleanor Thorne from her position as chief executive officer for cause, stripping her of all stock options and severance entitlements, and authorizing an immediate outreach to Gerald Vance to save the enterprise. The following afternoon, I returned to the Apex Shield headquarters for the first time since my termination. The environment inside the building was unrecognizable compared to the polished confidence of previous weeks. Executive assistants moved through the halls with anxious haste. Legal advisors huddled in quiet corners, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty hung over every department. But as I walked through the main glass lobby accompanied by my attorney, George Palmer, there were no security escorts awaiting me, nor were there cold glances from management. Instead, the board of directors had sent the senior corporate vice president to personally escort us to the executive conference suite on the 16th floor. When the heavy double doors of the boardroom opened, all 12 members of the board rose from their seats in unison. Their expressions were stripped of the corporate arrogance that usually characterized executive leadership. In its place was the raw, pragmatic desperation of individuals who realized their company was hours away from complete financial insolvency. Sitting at the head of the conference table, Board Chair Walter Montgomery gestured toward the head armchairs, inviting George and me to be seated. He opened the meeting with an earnest statement, acknowledging that the company had committed a profound ethical and operational error in their treatment of my tenure, and expressing an urgent desire to negotiate a mutually acceptable resolution that would allow Apex Shield to retain operational access to Aegis 9. I listened quietly to his opening remarks, resting my hands calmly on the polished conference table. I did not express anger, nor did I engage in theatrical grandstanding. When he finished, I opened my leather document portfolio and laid a single typed sheet of paper in the center of the table. I informed the board that while I possessed full legal authority to enforce a complete federal injunction that would permanently shut down all commercial deployments of Aegis 9, I retained a deep personal respect for the foundational engineering team and the hundreds of innocent employees whose livelihoods depended on the company's survival. Therefore, I was willing to execute an exclusive corporate licensing agreement, but strictly under 6 non-negotiable conditions. First, Apex Shield Systems would pay an immediate, upfront intellectual property licensing settlement of $20 million directly into my asset trust. Second, the company would execute a legally binding royalty agreement granting me 10% of all gross revenues generated by Aegis 9 and its derivative platforms in perpetuity. Third, I would be assigned an active, permanent voting seat on the board of directors, ensuring that engineering integrity and operational truth would always have a direct voice in corporate governance. Fourth, Apex Shield would issue a formal, unedited public press release, acknowledging me as the sole creator and primary patent owner of the Aegis 9 architecture, rectifying 26 years of corporate erasure. Fifth, the board would confirm the immediate, irrevocable termination of Eleanor Thorne for cause, with zero severance or executive indemnification. And sixth, Apex Shield would establish a $10 million internal corporate foundation, funded annually from executive bonuses, dedicated to providing advanced technical training, career transition support, and age discrimination legal assistance for technology professionals over 45 years of age across the industry. The boardroom sank into a tense, extended silence as the directors read through the terms. A senior financial director attempted to argue that the $20 million upfront fee, combined with the 10% ongoing royalty, would severely compress corporate profit margins for the upcoming fiscal year. George Palmer immediately leaned forward, placing a stack of federal court precedents on the table, pointing out with surgical precision that if the matter proceeded to trial, an emergency federal injunction would liquidate Apex Shield's operational assets within 90 days, resulting in total corporate dissolution. George noted that our terms were not a negotiation. They were the price of corporate survival. For 3 intense hours, the board deliberated in private, while George and I enjoyed coffee in the adjacent executive lounge. When we were invited back into the chamber, board chair Walter Montgomery stood at the head of the table holding the finalized legal agreement. He signed his name on the corporate line, passed the document across to me, and stated clearly that the board had unanimously accepted every single one of my conditions without modification. I took my pen, signed my name with a steady hand on the master licensor line, and felt the immense weight of a 17-year legal journey resolve into perfect balance. The public press release was issued 2 hours later, sending shockwaves through the national tech sector. Stock market analysts praised the resolution as a triumph of foundational intellectual property enforcement. and Apex Shield shares began a rapid recovery as the Department of Defense officially reinstated contract negotiations upon receiving confirmation of my signed licensing permit. Eleanor Thorne's corporate career was effectively destroyed, her name becoming a cautionary case study taught in business schools regarding the catastrophic dangers of executive hubris and the mistreatment of foundational technical talent. On Monday morning, I walked back into the engineering department at Apex Shield, not as a discarded employee collecting his box, but as a principal director of the company and the newly appointed head of system governance. As I walked down the central aisle, the young engineering staff stood up from their desks, offering a sincere, spontaneous applause that echoed through the building. Owen Miller walked over to my new corner office, holding 2 mugs of fresh coffee. He smiled warmly, handing me a mug as I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the Dallas skyline. Sitting at my desk, looking over the newly restructured organizational chart where experience was valued, mentorship was rewarded, and technical truth was protected, I felt a deep, abiding peace. I had spent 26 years building a fortress of code, and when corporate greed tried to tear me down, the very foundation I had laid brought justice back to where it belonged. I took a sip of my coffee, looked at the framed photograph of our original garage team resting proudly on my new desk, and knew that the story of Aegis 9 was finally complete.